Okay, so let's talk about synchronizing FPGA loops. So many FPGA applications require synchronization, and you might need to synchronize multiple loops with each other. So one use case is synchronizing acquisition and processing loops. Another one is synchronizing execution between multiple FPGA loops. You can also synchronize tasks to a common signal, for example, like a sample clock or a clock coming from somewhere else, like an external clock. And also synchronizing I/O from different C-series modules. So we'll talk about each of these bullets in more detail. So let's say we want to synchronize the acquisition and processing loops. Well, in the previous lesson, we talked about a way to do that. So in this case, we're going to be using FIFOs. So if you think about it, if you look at that top loop and the bottom loop, the top loop is acquiring data and the bottom loop is processing it. So by using a FIFO, we've actually kind of synchronized these loops. The top one is just going to be acquiring every 100 ticks or milliseconds or microseconds, however that's configured in the loop timer. And the bottom loop is synchronized with it. The bottom loop is going to read something from that FIFO as long as something is available to read in the FIFO. Okay, so the bottom loop is pretty much synchronized with the FIFO. Sometimes you might need to synchronize the execution of code in multiple loops. And one way we can do that is using occurrences. Okay, so let's take a look at this example on the block diagram. So on the block diagram, first we're going to use the generate occurrence function, and then we're going to pass that reference of that occurrence to the top loop and the bottom loop. Okay, so in the top loop, what's going on is we're executing some code, and then if that code meets some sort of condition and outputs a true for that condition, then we're going to go ahead and set that occurrence. Okay, and what that will do is it'll trigger that bottom loop. So notice that in red on the bottom loop you see wait on occurrence. Okay, that wait on occurrence is just going to wait for something to set the occurrence. Once that occurrence has been set, the bottom loop in parallel is going to go ahead and execute some code that's associated with that occurrence. Okay, so if you think about it, we've got this bottom loop that's running in parallel. Every single time some condition happened, we did a set occurrence, and that bottom loop is going to execute some code that corresponds to that. Okay, so by using occurrences, you can see how we can synchronize the execution of parallel loops here. Okay, on this slide we see another example of using occurrences. So let's take a look at some actual code. Again, we're going to first do a generate occurrence, and we're going to pass that reference into both of these loops. Okay, so at the top loop, we see we have the top loop executing with a period of 10 on that loop timer. And then inside the code, we see that we're acquiring from some analog inputs and doing some processing on that. And then every time that happens, we're going to, every single time that the analog input processing is finished, it'll immediately set that occurrence. So if you look at that bottom loop, in parallel, every time that set occurrence happens, it's going to execute some logic. So in this case, every time the set occurrence has been set, we're going to go ahead and make the digital line to true. And then we're going to wait a pulse width, and then we're going to set that digital output line back to false. Okay, so pretty much every time we finish processing that analog input, we're going to output a pulse with a specified pulse width. And that's happening in parallel at the same time as that acquisition loop on top. Okay, so this is just another example, and hopefully that'll help you think of things that you might want to do in your application. Okay, so now we're going to do a demonstration of occurrences in LabVIEW. And we're going to synchronize the execution of code in multiple FPGA loops. Okay, so let's go into LabVIEW. Okay, so now that we're in LabVIEW, if you want, you can follow along. This project in VI is found in the Exercises Demonstrations folder. So I'm going to open up the Occurrences VI right here, which we see right over here. And let's go ahead and look at the block diagram. Okay, so I'm going to rearrange this so you can see the block diagram and front panel at the same time. So notice here we've got generate occurrence, okay, and this reference is getting passed into 3 loops. Okay, so over here this loop is going to set it. Okay, so if the set occurrence control is false, nothing is going to happen. But if I set it to true, then it's going to set this occurrence. And then if we look at these bottom 2 loops, both of these 2 loops are waiting on occurrence. Okay, so by setting the occurrence up here, it's going to trigger something to happen in this loop and also this bottom loop. Okay, so you can actually have multiple loops waiting on the same occurrence. So the code here that we have here is just more of a proof of concept. all we're going to do is we're going to toggle that LED. Okay, so we're going to turn it on or off. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this, and let's take a look at this proof of concept. So if I was to set the occurrence, notice that both of these loops down here were able to see the occurrence, and they both executed some code that was synchronized with that occurrence. Okay, so if I press it again, notice that it toggles them both off. So as you can see right now, both of those bottom loops are synchronized with that top loop using an occurrence. Now you can synchronize FPGA loops using occurrences. Next, we will synchronize FPGA loops by sharing a common signal.